I never thought I'd end up here, living in a place that time seemed to have forgotten. The asylum stretches across the hill like a crumbling crown, its windows darkened with years of dust and neglect. Even from the gravel road leading up to it, I could feel its weight, a hollow, waiting kind of silence that pressed against my chest. The job sounded simple enough: caretaker, archivist, someone to keep watch while the asylum waits for whatever it waits for. But standing at the edge of the property, I felt an unease I couldn't name, a prickling sensation along my spine, as if the building itself was aware of me. I had taken this job after the last few months of my life had left me hollow. My apartment had felt smaller with every passing day, filled with echoes of things I no longer wanted to remember. When the listing appeared, almost as if it had been waiting for me, I convinced myself it was exactly what I needed: quiet, isolation, a place to start over. Something about the asylum's decayed grandeur felt welcoming in a strange, suffocating way. The caretaker's notice had been brief, just enough to make me curious. And curiosity, I have learned, is far more dangerous than fear. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I moved through the halls, my footsteps echoing back at me from the high ceilings. Doors that should have been locked were slightly ajar, and the air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that an old building like this had its quirks, that my imagination was just feeding on the shadows. But then I noticed small things: a chair slightly tilted from where I remembered placing it, a faint draft that moved against the natural airflow, whispers that couldn't be explained, soft, almost casual, like someone muttering just beyond comprehension. By the second morning, the air had grown colder, settling into my bones as I wandered the halls with a flashlight. In the east wing, the peeling wallpaper revealed messages scrawled underneath: names, dates, warnings, but they were faded and smudged, almost erased by time. I ran my fingers over them and felt the faintest vibration, as if the walls themselves remembered more than I could. I rationalized it: a previous caretaker, pranksters, rodents, scratching at the surface. Anything but what my gut told me: that someone, or something, had left this place the way it was for a reason, and it did not want me here. It wasn't until I found the room at the end of the west corridor that my unease solidified into something heavier. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and inside, a single chair faced the wall, a notebook perched on the seat. I couldn't tell if it had been waiting for me, or if it had been placed there moments before I arrived. I opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed, covered with a scrawled handwriting that wavered between urgency and despair. At the top of the first page was a simple phrase: "Do not forget the rules. They are watching." I should have closed it and walked away, but I couldn't. The words seemed to seep into my skin, crawling beneath my collar and settling along my spine. I felt the air thicken, the silence pressing closer. And for the first time since I arrived, I noticed the way the shadows seemed to shift with intention. My heartbeat picked up, slow and measured, trying to remind me I was in control. But the notebook's warning lingered, and I realized that this was only the beginning. Something about this asylum, about the walls themselves, was waiting, and I had already stepped inside. The morning after my first night, the sun barely touched the asylum's roof before it disappeared behind the clouds, leaving the place shrouded in a dim gray. I had thought the daylight would make it less intimidating, that sunlight could chase away the oppressive silence, but the walls seemed to absorb it, turning even the brightest hours into something muted, almost mournful. I walked the main corridor again, tracing the outlines of peeling paint and rusted railings, trying to convince myself that nothing here wanted to harm me. But deep down, I already knew that hope was a fragile illusion. It was then that I met Mr. Callahan, the man who would be my only point of contact in this forsaken place. He was older than I expected, thin, with sharp eyes that seemed to look through the air itself, rather than at me. He greeted me quietly, with a nod that carried weight, and led me into a small office tucked behind a locked door. The walls inside were lined with filing cabinets, all labeled with dates and names, some going back decades. The air smelled faintly of ink and dust. He didn't waste time on small talk. Instead, he handed me a worn folder and said, "Read these carefully. Everything in here matters. Break the rules, and you will regret it." I opened the folder to find a list of rules, typed and underlined, yet oddly imprecise, as if someone had tried to translate them from another language or from memory. The rules were simple at first glance. Never enter a room after midnight without knocking 3 times. Do not answer if someone calls your name from the empty halls. Never touch what was left behind. Respect the silence. Do not speak unless spoken to. Walk only where the floorboards creak. Do not close doors completely. They must remain slightly open. Leave before the fog rises. Reading them made no immediate sense. Walk only where the floorboards creak, I whispered, almost laughing at the absurdity. Leave before the fog rises. This is just superstition. But Mr. Callahan's expression was unchanged, and the air in the office thickened as if the rules themselves carried weight. He leaned back in his chair and spoke slowly. They are not suggestions. They are protections. The patients who lived here, some of them left these warnings before they disappeared. You'll learn why soon enough. His voice was calm, yet carried a strange insistence, a quiet urgency that pricked at my curiosity. I wanted to ask questions, to push him for more, but I noticed the way his eyes flicked to the corner of the room, and I understood some things could not be spoken aloud. As I walked the halls afterward, the rules replayed in my mind, and I found myself watching the floorboards differently. Each creak underfoot felt intentional, as though the building itself was guiding me. I began leaving doors slightly ajar, mimicking the odd instructions, and felt a subtle relief, like tension uncoiling from the walls. But at the same time, the shadows seemed to grow longer, reaching further than they should have, lingering even after I passed. By the afternoon, I discovered the small common room where old patient journals were stacked in neat piles. Their pages were filled with scrawled handwriting, frantic at times, meticulous at others. Each notebook referenced the rules, sometimes in coded phrases. The whispers come when doors are closed. Open them, and they will not find you. Another, never follow the sound of your name. It is not yours. Reading these, a cold realization began to settle in my chest. The rules were not arbitrary. They were survival guidelines. As evening approached, the clouds thickened into a low crawling fog that swallowed the grounds beyond the building. I walked the outer corridors slowly, testing the edges of the rules. The wind rattled the windows, but I followed the instructions. Doors left ajar. Floorboards intentionally creaked. Silence observed. The building seemed to breathe around me, responding to my compliance. Yet even as I obeyed, the walls whispered, not words, exactly, but a faint, persistent hum that made my skin prickle. Somewhere, far away, I thought I heard footsteps echoing my own. I stopped, listening. The sound didn't stop when I did. My heart began to race, slow and deliberate, reminding me that curiosity had brought me here, but survival depended on restraint. I returned to Mr. Callahan's office to ask a single question about the fog, but he was gone. The chair tilted slightly backward, papers scattered across the floor. On top of the folder of rules was a note, short and stark. Do not break them. They are patient warnings, and they were not ignored without consequence. I sat back against the wall, staring at the note, and felt the first real chill of fear. I had arrived ready to catalog an empty building, a place frozen in time. But now I understood. The asylum was far from empty. The rules were far from arbitrary, and someone was waiting to ensure they were followed. The rules were lodged in my mind like splinters I couldn't remove. I repeated them to myself, as I walked the halls that night, testing each one silently. Don't answer if someone calls your name. Walk only where the floorboards creak. Leave before the fog rises. I told myself. I was cautious, careful. But curiosity, I realized too late, is rarely so obedient. It was near midnight when I heard it. My name, faint but unmistakable, drifting down the east corridor. Evan, the voice was soft, familiar, yet wrong. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. My first instinct was to obey, to retreat into the shadows and let the sound vanish. But something tugged at me, a memory, a question, a small voice in the back of my mind that whispered, "Who is it?" Before I could stop myself, I stepped forward, ignoring the first rule I had sworn to uphold. The corridor stretched endlessly before me, the walls swollen with shadow, the dim light flickering overhead. Each step brought a creak from the floorboards, and I felt a strange sense of relief. I was following the rules, in a way. But the voice grew clearer, closer, yet impossible to locate. It didn't echo. It didn't reflect. It simply existed, surrounding me, brushing against my ears like a cold wind. I tried calling back, but my throat tightened. Instead, I whispered my own name, testing the boundary, and the voice paused. The morning after the first violation, I woke to the lingering hum of unease in my chest. The whispers from the night before were gone, but their echo remained, a faint pulse beneath my skin. I tried to convince myself it had been imagination, a trick of exhaustion and isolation, yet the memory of the voice, impossibly close and impossibly empty, made my stomach twist. I spent the day retracing my steps through the halls, testing the rules again. Walk only where the floorboards creak. Leave doors slightly open. Respect the silence. Each action brought a strange sense of relief, as though the asylum itself exhaled when I obeyed. Yet the first violation left a residue, a prickling awareness that I was no longer simply observing the building, I was participating in something older, something patient. It was late afternoon when I heard it again, my name, faint and coaxing, drifting from the far west corridor. This time, I did not respond. I froze, listening, waiting for the sound to dissipate on its own. But it did not. Instead, I noticed a pattern I hadn't before, the way shadows pooled near corners. The subtle flicker of light from broken windows, the creak of floorboards, not under my feet, but somewhere ahead. The rules were no longer abstract, they were directions, guides to navigating the building safely. I turned toward the west corridor, following the floorboards' guidance, careful to step only where they groaned beneath me. The air grew heavier with each step, a damped chill settling into my lungs. Then I saw it, a door, slightly ajar, as the rules demanded. But the room beyond was darker than the rest, a void that seemed to absorb light itself. I stopped at the threshold, knowing instinctively that this was where I would understand something I wasn't meant to. Inside, the room was empty of furniture, but the walls were lined with small, crude drawing symbols etched deep into the plaster, jagged lines forming figures that moved subtly in the corner of my vision. I blinked, and they seemed to shift, retreating into shadows only to reappear moments later. A low hum filled the space, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. I realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity that these marks were not random, they were warnings. Markers left by those who had walked this path before me. I stepped forward, careful to let the floorboards creak, and one of the symbols seemed to twist, reacting to my movement. The hum grew louder, not a sound exactly, but a vibration, a warning I could feel more than hear. Then I saw them teeny scratches along the doorframe, forming letters I could just barely read. Do not follow the voice. My stomach turned. The second rule, the one I had just obeyed by ignoring the call, had a purpose beyond survival. It was a test of restraint. A cold breeze whispered along the back of my neck, carrying with it a faint metallic scent. I dared not turn, fearing whatever presence lurked in the shadows. I had read about this in the old journals, the scribbled notes left by past caretakers. The entity here did not need to appear to be dangerous. Its observation alone was enough to unnerve, to unsettle, to bend reality into something that made you question your senses. I took a measured breath, reminding myself to follow the rules. Each one had a consequence, and I had already learned the first dot as I left the room. I noticed that the corridor behind me had changed. Doors I remembered being ajar were now fully closed, the shadows thicker, heavier. The hum followed me, subtle but persistent, and I felt the presence of something moving just beyond my vision. I quickened my pace along the creaking floorboards, resisting the urge to glance into the darkened doorways, focusing instead on each step, each careful movement. By the time I returned to my room, my heart was racing despite the calm tone of the night. The second rule had made sense. Not answering the voice was not merely caution, it was survival. Breaking or bending it invited attention. And now, the asylum had my attention. It was teaching me, reminding me, guiding me with invisible hands that left nothing untouched. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the notebook I had found on my first day. The warnings seemed to pulse, almost alive, and I realized that the rules were only the beginning. Each violation, each obedience, was part of a larger puzzle I had yet to understand, and as the night approached again, I knew that the voice would return, that the shadows would shift, and that the patience of the asylum was infinite. The rules were no longer suggestions. They were chains. I woke to a quiet house of fog pressing against the windows. The morning light was dim, muted by the thick haze outside, and the halls of the asylum felt heavier than before. The rules had become my lifeline, but the questions they raised were multiplying faster than I could answer. I needed to know why the patients had left these warnings, why the building seemed aware, and what, exactly, it was protecting or punishing. I began searching more systematically, moving beyond the hallways I had wandered. There was a section of the east wing I hadn't yet explored, doors that were always locked and labeled with faded warning signs. Do not enter quarantined. I found a key in a small drawer in Mr. Callahan's office. He must have left it for me, though I couldn't be certain, and approached the first door. The metal handle was cold under my fingers, and I hesitated, recalling the rules. Do not touch what was left behind. But the key in my hand was an invitation, a signal that some warnings were meant to be bypassed. Inside, the room was a time capsule. Dust covered the floor in thick layers, and the air smelled of rust and decay. In the corner, a desk had been overturned, drawers yanked open, papers scattered across the floor. Among them, I found a small stack of journals, each labeled with a year and a name, fading into obscurity. Staff, caretakers, even patients. I sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. The journals were disjointed, written in a hurried, almost panicked hand. One of them, dated 30 years ago, belonged to a man named Harold Grimes, a caretaker who had vanished without explanation. He wrote about the rules, but in more detail than I had seen. He described shadows that moved independently, whispers that spoke not in words but in intent, and corridors that altered their dimensions if a rule was broken. One entry chilled me to the bone. They watch through the walls. They know your thoughts before you speak them. Do not test them. The list is your shield. Obey or vanish. Another journal, older and bound in cracked leather, belonged to a patient who had been transferred here after a failed experiment in behavioral therapy. The entries were almost incoherent, fragmented sentences describing things I dared not imagine. The walls pulse. They remember us. When we answer, they come. The rules, they are alive. The words seemed to pulse under my fingers, a subtle vibration that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Curious, I moved to the security room. The monitors were outdated, some flickering with static, but a few still worked. The footage was grainy, black and white, but it revealed decades of activity. There were caretakers wandering the halls, always following the rules. And then there were others, figures I didn't recognize, slipping between shadows, bending the light in unnatural ways. On one tape, I saw a man answer a call of his name from an empty hallway. The shadows stretched toward him before he vanished entirely, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air, like the world itself had swallowed him. The deeper I dug, the more I understood that the asylum's rules were more than superstition. They were documentation of survival, refined over decades of trial and error. Every warning, every restriction had been learned the hard way by those who came before me, and yet the rules didn't feel complete. Something was missing, a piece of the puzzle that no journal, no tape, could fully explain. In one of the journals, I discovered a crude map of the building, overlaid with annotations, safe paths, dangerous rooms, zones marked in symbols I didn't recognize. Some corridors were labeled with dates and names, presumably those who had disappeared. I traced one path with my finger, heart hammering, and realized it led directly to the west wing, the area where I had first heard the voice. The same wing that had shifted and changed when I obeyed the rules. I sank to the floor, overwhelmed. The asylum was not merely haunted. It was sentient. It had learned. It had observed every caretaker, every patient, every rule broken and followed. The rules were not just protections, they were contracts, written in the language of survival. And the entities that enforced them were patient, meticulous, and far older than anyone alive. I needed more. There was one room I had not entered, one that the journals only hinted at, the Central Archive. A space that had once held the asylum's darkest secrets. According to Grimes' notes, it contained records too dangerous to touch, things that even the rules could not fully explain. Yet the path to it was marked with warnings, symbols carved into walls and floors. Do not enter. Obey the list. They see all. Despite the terror thrumming through my veins, I felt compelled. The rules had guided me this far. They had protected me. Perhaps, if I followed them exactly, I could uncover the truth without disappearing like those before me. I rose to my feet, brushing dust from my clothes, and began the slow trek toward the Central Archive, aware that every step, every breath was being watched, measured, recorded. The asylum was no longer a building. It was a living record, a silent observer, and I was now part of its history. And as I approached the archive, I felt the weight of the past pressing in, the whispers of the vanished brushing against my mind, warning me that what I was about to see might be far worse than the absence I had feared. The corridor to the Central Archive stretched longer than it should have. The air grew colder with every step, pressing into my lungs, and the fog outside the broken windows seemed to curl around the building, seeping in where it could. I followed the rules meticulously. Floorboards that groaned under my weight, doors left slightly ajar, silence observed. Every step felt deliberate, every breath measured. Yet the deeper I went, the heavier the presence became, as if the building itself were aware that I was approaching its core. I reached the final door, the one that had been marked in the journals with warnings that made the skin crawl. The key in my hand trembled, though I wasn't sure if it was fear or anticipation. I inserted it, twisted, and the lock clicked open. The door moved slowly, reluctantly, revealing darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the weak light from the corridor. The shadows inside shifted, not cast by anything visible, but moving independently, like ink bleeding across the walls. As soon as I stepped inside, I heard it, a low, scraping sound that came from every direction at once. The floorboards creaked under my own feet, but there was something else moving beneath them, something alive, something patient. I wanted to retreat, but curiosity and necessity anchored me in place. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief instant, I thought I saw a figure, tall and thin, retreating into the deeper shadows. The air around me pulsed, vibrating against my skin like a heartbeat. Then the whispers began again. Not words, but intent commands, warnings, repetitions of the rules I had been given. Do not touch. Leave before the fog rises. Respect the silence. The voice or voices were everywhere, pressing in on my senses, making it impossible to tell where they came from. My heart raced, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, following the instructions I had learned. Step by careful step, something moved in the corner of my Aja's shadow, detaching itself from the wall, slithering along the floor toward me. I froze, willing myself to stay still, letting the creaking floorboards guide me. It paused, hovering just beyond the reach of the flashlight, a darkness that seemed to absorb light and sound alike. I could feel its gaze, though it had no eyes, as if it were reading my very thoughts, measuring my fear. I realized then that the rules were not merely for protection, they were its language, a way to communicate boundaries I could survive within. One wrong step, one ignored instruction, and I would become part of the archive myself. Another whisper in the walls. Panic threatened to take me, but I forced calm. I moved slowly, deliberately, following the floorboards' groan, letting the shadows flow around me without touching them. The figure or presence moved closer, undulating like smoke. I could feel the cold press against my skin, creeping along my neck, my arms, my spine. A whisper slithered into my ear. You should not be here. My blood ran cold, but I did not respond. I obeyed, silent, careful, letting every action be guided by the rules. Suddenly, a sharp scrape echoed from behind, and I turned just enough to see a door slam shut at the far end of the room, though no wind had passed. My flashlight flickered again, revealing dozens of faint scratches across the walls, some fresh, some decades old, all forming shapes I didn't recognize. The hum in the room intensified, resonating through the floor, the walls, even my teeth. I realized the presence was all around me, not just in the shadows but in the very structure of the building itself. I stumbled backward, careful to step only where the floorboards creaked, my breathing shallow. The shadows seemed to lunge toward me, then recoil, testing, probing. I had never felt more aware of my own fragility, of the thin line between survival and disappearance. My hand brushed against a stack of papers on a nearby table, and I froze, recalling the rule: do not touch what was left behind. The presence recoiled instantly, like a live thing had been struck. I withdrew my hand, heart hammering, and the room fell silent, the oppressive air relaxing just slightly. I understood then, with terrifying clarity, that the entity did not need to attack outright. Its patience was infinite, its methods subtle. The warnings, the rules, the whispers, they were all part of a system designed to test, manipulate, and ultimately enforce obedience. One wrong move, one act of curiosity or defiance, and the consequences would be immediate or drawn out over decades. I backed toward the exit, following the floorboard's guidance. Every shadow twisted, every corner seemed to pulse, but I kept moving, careful not to provoke it. The scraping sounds followed me, fading as I obeyed each instruction, until finally I reached the corridor outside. The door behind me slammed shut of its own accord, and the whispers ceased, leaving only the faint hum of the building's consciousness lingering in my ears. I collapsed against the wall, trembling, and for the first time truly understood the scale of the threat I was facing. The asylum was alive, patient, and deliberate. It did not need to chase Met, simply waited, a predator in plain sight, guiding me through rules I barely understood and observing my every move. I had survived this encounter, but only by absolute obedience. As I sat there, catching my breath, I realized something worse than fear had taken root: knowledge. I now understood that the rules, the whispers, the shadows, they were all part of a system I could not hope to fully comprehend. And the entity, whatever it was, would not forget. Not my missteps, not my curiosity, not my presence. It would wait, patient and eternal, until the next violation. I didn't see Mr. Callahan for 2 days after my encounter in the archive. His office was locked, the chair empty, papers scattered across the floor, as though he had left in a hurry. The quiet was heavier now, pressing against my chest, making every breath deliberate. I had assumed he was my anchor here, the one person who understood the rules, who could explain them, who had been through all of this before. But the asylum had a way of rearranging assumptions, peeling away any sense of safety. On the third night, I heard a sound at my door, 3 slow knocks. My heart stopped. Midnight had passed. According to the rules, no one should knock after midnight unless it wasn't someone. I sat frozen, not daring to move. The knocks came again, softer, as though whoever was outside was hesitant. Then a voice. "It's me, Callahan. Let me in." I rose slowly, blood pounding in my ears. The voice was his same cadence, same low rasp, but something felt off. Too steady, too rehearsed. I pressed my ear to the door. "Where have you been?" I whispered. Silence. Then, "Please, open the door. We don't have much time." I hesitated, the rules warring in my mind. The second rule: do not answer if someone calls your name from the empty halls. But this wasn't my name. This was him. Or was it? My fingers brushed the doorknob before I yanked them back. "Say the first rule," I whispered, my voice trembling. A pause. Then, perfectly recited. "Never enter a room after midnight without knocking 3 times. My stomach dropped. He had answered correctly, but there was something about the way he spoke, mechanical, as if reading from memory instead of knowing. I stepped back from the door, my heart hammering. "Where were you?" Another pause. "Watching." The word came out wrong. Not his voice anymore. Lower, rougher. I stumbled back. The doorknob rattled once, twice, then went still. After a long silence, footsteps retreated down the hall, slow and deliberate, fading into nothing. The next morning, I searched the building for him. The office was still locked. The halls were empty. In the east wing, near the quarantined rooms, I found a single piece of paper taped to the wall. The handwriting was unmistakably his, frantic and jagged. "Do not trust me. I stayed too long. It changes you. I can't stop it." My blood turned to ice. He hadn't disappeared. He had been claimed. The asylum, or whatever lived inside, it had not just rules, but a method. It wore people down. It steadied them. And then, when they broke, or when they stayed too long, it took them. I thought of his eyes the first day we met, sharp, watchful, and realized they weren't just the eyes of a man who had survived. They were the eyes of a man already on the edge of becoming something else. I searched further, following a faint trail of papers and scratches down a corridor I had avoided before. The walls here were covered in symbols, older and deeper than the others. Some looked like chains. Some looked like mouths. At the end of the hall, I found what remained of Mr. Callahan's belongings. His coat, his flashlight, his notebook, all neatly folded on a chair, as if waiting. But there was no sign of him. Only the hum, faint but steady, pulsing through the walls like a heartbeat. Flipping through his notebook, I saw entries written in 2 distinct hands at first. Then something else, jagged and alien, hijacking his words. "They are patient. They watch. They learn your habits. When you forget yourself, they take you. You become the warning." I dropped the notebook, my hands trembling. The rules had protected me from the building, but not from its slow theft of self. Callahan had not simply been my mentor. He had been my warning. When I returned to my room, the air felt different, colder, thicker. On my desk lay another note, not in Callahan's hand, but in the same jagged script that had overtaken his. "It is your turn now." I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the note as the walls seemed to pulse faintly around me. The asylum had taken my guide, leaving me alone with the rules. Or perhaps not alone at all. The night after I found Callahan's final note, I couldn't sleep. The asylum felt closer than ever, as though the walls themselves were leaning inward, pressing against me, whispering through the cracks. Every rule I had memorized repeated in my mind like a litany. But even the rules felt thinner now, stretched to breaking dot at 2 a.m. I heard it, the creak of a floorboard outside my door. My heart pounded. I knew that sound. Someone or something was pacing the hall, slow, deliberate steps, testing the silence. I stayed still, holding my breath, waiting for it to pass. But it didn't. It stopped outside my door. A whisper slipped through the wood. "You can't leave." I squeezed my eyes shut, but the words sank into me. Leave. The option had always existed in theory, but never in practice. Now the asylum itself acknowledged it. It knew my thoughts. It wanted me to stay. That meant leaving was possible. I packed in silence at dawn, shoving the essentials into my bag: flashlight, water, Callahan's notebook. The rules echoed in my mind. Do not leave through the main doors after midnight. Do not take anything left behind. Do not step where the floorboards are silent. Every exit strategy violated at least one of them. To escape, I would have to break the system by noon. The fog outside had thickened, curling against the windows like living smoke. I stood in the main corridor, staring at the front doors. They looked smaller now, warped by time, the wood swollen with moisture. They had always been there, a way out, yet no one had used them. My hand hovered over the handle. Cold radiated from the metal, seeping into my skin. That was when I heard the voice again, this time from behind me. Callahan's voice, or something wearing it. "Don't," it said softly. "You'll never survive out there. Better to stay. Follow the rules. Obey." I turned, and for a moment, I thought it was him, standing in the shadows at the end of the hall. But the figure was wrong: too tall, limbs too long, face shifting with every flicker of light. I forced my gaze away, remembering the rule about silence. The creature wanted me to answer, to acknowledge, to give it power. I turned back to the door, but my body refused to move. My hand shook on the handle. My heart screamed for escape, but the asylum pressed down with its will, urging me to submit. I realized then the cruel truth. The rules were not protections. They were chains, conditioning me, teaching me obedience, until leaving felt impossible. I had two choices: stay here, forever, obeying until the asylum decided to take me, as it had taken Callahan, or break a rule, shatter its system and risk whatever waited on the other side. I tightened my grip on the handle. The rule was clear: do not leave through the main doors after midnight. But it was midday now. The rule didn't forbid me. Not yet. The asylum knew. That's why it had sent Callahan's imitation to warn me. It feared this choice. I pulled. The doors groaned, stiff and ancient, but they moved. A rush of air blasted inward, thick with the scent of rot and soil. The fog outside swirled violently, as if aware of me, as if alive. Beyond the threshold, the ground stretched into pale nothingness. Not the courtyard I remembered, but a void cloaked in shifting mist. I hesitated. The world beyond was no safer than the asylum, maybe worse. My legs trembled. Behind me, the figure moved closer, its footsteps echoing on the creaking floorboards, each step deliberate, patient. I had only seconds. I stepped forward, one foot through the threshold. The cold was immediate, biting into my skin, pulling me downward. I fought it, dragging my other leg across. The mist rose, wrapping around me, burning against my flesh, like ice and fire at once. My vision blurred. The whispers returned, furious now, 1,000 voices screaming at once. "Come back. You belong to us." I staggered forward, blind, choking on the fog. Each step was agony, every instinct begging me to turn back. My body wanted the asylum. It had trained me to need its walls, its rules. Leaving felt like tearing myself in two, but I kept going. Finally, the whispers thinned, fading into a dull hum. The fog parted slightly, revealing a narrow path of cracked earth. Behind me, the asylum loomed in the mist, its windows dark, its doors sealed. For the first time, I had crossed a boundary it didn't want me to cross. And yet, as I stood there, gasping for breath, one final thought chilled me more than any shadow or whisper inside those walls. I had broken a rule, and rules, once broken, carry consequences. I walked for what felt like hours. The cracked earth stretched on in every direction, vanishing into fog. My breaths came shallow, my legs heavy, each step harder than the last. I should have felt relief being outside, but there was no relief, only an emptiness deeper than the asylum's corridors. The silence here was total, a vacuum pressing against my ears. I glanced back once. The asylum was still there, a silhouette in the mist, but its shape had changed. The windows were gone, replaced by blank walls, and the roof sagged like a living thing. It didn't look like a building anymore. It looked like something crouching, waiting. Even at this distance, I could feel its gaze. Callahan's notebook trembled in my hands. The last page had been blank before. Now, words had appeared, written in the jagged script. There is no outside. A chill rippled through me. I shoved the notebook back into my bag and kept walking, but the path under my feet began to narrow. The fog closed in, thicker and thicker, until I could no longer see my own hands. The air turned heavy, almost liquid, pressing down on my lungs. My footsteps slowed. Somewhere behind me, I heard the creak of a floorboard. My stomach twisted. Out here, there were no floorboards, just earth. But the sound was unmistakable, slow and deliberate, the same rhythm as the halls inside. I broke into a run. The fog bent around me, shapes flickering at its edges, doorways, corridors, glimpses of peeling wallpaper. My pulse roared in my ears. I tripped, catching myself, and my palm landed on wood, not earth. When I looked up, my breath caught. I was standing in the asylum's lobby. The front doors were shut tight, bolted, their handles coated in frost. The fog pressed against the windows like an ocean trying to break in. The whispers started again, soft at first, then louder, filling every corner of the room. You belong. You cannot leave. You never left. My bag slipped from my shoulder. I backed away, heart hammering, as the building seemed to shift, closing in around me. The rules were still etched on the wall, but a new line had been added at the bottom, carved deep into the plaster, fresh and wet, as though it had been written in that very moment. Rule 8. You cannot escape. I stared at the words until they blurred, my vision swimming. The building hummed, pleased, the sound vibrating through my bones. Somewhere in the corridors, a door slammed, then another, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. I understood then that I had never really left. The asylum had only shown me its outside the way it had shown me its rules, partial truths, pieces of a larger trap. My escape was just another hallway, another test. I sank to the floor, trembling, as the whispers faded into one voice, low and calm, close enough to feel its breath at my ear. Welcome back. This time, you'll stay.